In today's video, you'll learn something that can really help you. So like it and subscribe so you don't miss the next ones. Let's get started.
January 3rd, 2026. A U.S. military operation captures Nicolás Maduro on Venezuelan territory. Within hours, it is not only the financial markets that panic. 1,600 kilometers away, in Havana, the lights begin to flicker differently. This is not a common blackout. It is the beginning of a countdown that no one imagined was possible. Cuba has 15 days of oil. 15 days to keep hospitals operating. 15 days before public transportation comes to a complete stop. 15 days until the electrical grid enters terminal collapse. 15 days before an entire nation is forced to face the most brutal question of modern geopolitics. What happens when a country literally runs out of energy? But how did we get here? How did an island of 11 million inhabitants become hostage to a single commodity? The answer lies in decades of decisions that turned Cuba into the most extreme example of energy dependence on the planet. And it all begins with an agreement that seemed brilliant at the time. Since 2000, Venezuela and Cuba had maintained a strategic pact that went far beyond simple trade. Caracas sent 46,500 barrels of oil per day to Havana. In return, Cuba provided doctors, teachers, and something even more valuable, military and intelligence support to Maduro's regime. It was a perfect symbiosis. Venezuela had oil but needed political support. Cuba had human capital but lived in energy darkness. This agreement represented 73% of all the energy consumed in Cuba. It was not just important. It was existential. But there was one detail that made everything even more fragile. Cuba did not pay in international currency. Payment was made in services. Doctors in the slums of Caracas. Military advisors training security forces. Intelligence agents monitoring dissidents. It was a barter economy elevated to the geopolitical level. And it worked. Until it didn't. Because besides Venezuela, Cuba had a second supplier, Mexico. Another 17,000 barrels per day arrived through a direct commercial agreement. Together, these two countries ensured that the lights stayed on, that buses kept running, that hospitals kept their equipment powered. But here is the problem with dependencies. They only work until someone cuts the cord. When Maduro falls, the Venezuela-Cuba agreement is not suspended. It simply ceases to exist. The new government in Caracas has other priorities. It needs to rebuild relations with Washington. It needs access to international financial markets. It needs to show the world that Venezuela has turned the page. And in this new chapter, there is no room to continue subsidizing an ally that now represents a political burden. The last Venezuelan oil tankers dock in Havana in the second week of January. After that, silence. No ships on the way. No forecast of resumption. No plan B. Cuba still has Mexico. But not for long. On January 28th, the American president signs Executive Order 14380. The document is technical, bureaucratic, full of elaborate legal language. But the message is crystal clear: any country that sells oil to Cuba will face secondary sanctions. Tariffs that can reach up to 25% on all its exports to the United States. Blocking of financial transactions. Exclusion from international payment systems. For Mexico, the calculation is simple. It exports more than $300 billion in international currency per year to the United States. The 17,000 barrels per day sent to Cuba generate less than $500 million annually. The math doesn't add up. Mexico suspends shipments. And now? Now Cuba is alone. The island's strategic reserves can sustain the country for exactly 15 days operating at very minimal capacity. Every hour without oil means more schools closed, factories shut down, hospitals without electricity. The Cuban economy never prepared for a shock of this magnitude, because there was always a patron subsidizing the island. If you are enjoying this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. And leave in the comments which city or country you are watching this from right now. Because what comes next is not just the story of Cuba. It is a warning about how energy moves the modern world and what happens when it simply disappears. The first thing to collapse is not the lights. It is trust. When blackouts begin to stretch from 8 hours to 12, then to 16, the population realizes that something has changed. This is no longer a temporary crisis like so many others the country has faced. It is different. Hospitals begin canceling non-emergency surgeries. Schools operate only 3 days a week. Public transportation runs at 40% of its usual fleet. And the black market explodes. A gallon of gasoline that used to cost the equivalent of 3 weeks' salary now costs 5, then 6. Basic foods that were already scarce become luxury items. 1 kilogram of rice costs 10 times the average monthly salary. Not because there is no rice, but because there is no way to transport it, store it, distribute it without electricity functioning consistently. The national currency enters free fall. The Cuban peso loses 60% of its value in 2 weeks. People stop accepting official money in transactions. They want foreign currency, gold, anything that holds value when the lights go out. But what about the historic allies? Where are Russia and China at this moment? The answer is technically present, but practically absent. Moscow issues statements condemning the American sanctions. It calls Executive Order 14380 illegal economic asphyxiation, and promises solidarity support to Cuba. The Kremlin announces the dispatch of 2 oil tankers as a gesture of solidarity. 2 ships. Together, they carry 80,000 barrels. That keeps Cuba running for exactly a day and a half. China follows the same diplomatic script. It condemns the blockade in speeches at the UN. It offers credit lines for the purchase of equipment. But when it comes to physical oil arriving at Cuban ports, Beijing remains cautious. It does not want to risk its trade relations with the United States because of Cuba. Chinese exports to American territory total more than $500 billion annually in international currency. Cuba is not worth that price. Russian and Chinese support exists on paper, but evaporates in practice. Because in the real world of geopolitics, ideological solidarity has very clear financial limits. Meanwhile, in Havana, the situation deteriorates by the day. Blackouts reach 22 consecutive hours. Hospitals operate only on generators that consume rationed diesel. Emergency surgeries are performed under flashlight light when fuel runs out. Medicines that require refrigeration are lost by the thousands. Diabetics go without insulin. Cardiac patients without controlled medication. The potable water infrastructure begins to fail because electric pumps stop working. Entire neighborhoods go days without supply. People return to fetching water from wells, rivers, any available source. Diseases transmitted by contaminated water begin to appear. Diarrhea, cholera, hepatitis. Violence increases. Not in an organized way, but spontaneously. Looting of food warehouses. Invasions of fuel stations. Clashes over drinking water. The government responds with curfews, but has no way to enforce them when even police vehicles do not have enough fuel. And the question no one wants to ask out loud finally emerges. How long can the regime stay in power when it can no longer provide electricity, water, and food? The answer begins to take shape in the streets. Spontaneous protests erupt in several cities. They start small, disorganized, without clear leadership. But they grow. Thousands of people in the streets demanding not only energy, but real change. The government tries to repress them, but even repression has energy limits. Riot trucks need diesel. Surveillance systems need electricity. It is in this context that the first signs of internal fracture emerge. Unconfirmed reports indicate tensions within the armed forces. Mid-ranking officers questioning orders. Soldiers refusing to fire on protesters who are their own neighbors. The regime has always rested on 2 pillars: control of information and control of force. Now, without energy to keep either fully functioning, cracks begin to appear. The international community watches, but does not intervene. The United States firmly maintains the sanctions. The European Union expresses humanitarian concern but offers no concrete solutions. Latin America is divided between supporting Cuba out of solidarity and avoiding confrontation with Washington. The UN debates, but does not act. Cuba is alone. And the clock keeps running. Day 15. The reserves are gone. Not in a dramatic way, with an official countdown. They simply ran out. The last main thermoelectric plant reduces operations to 12% of capacity. Havana plunges into darkness for 26 consecutive hours. Other cities face total blackouts. There is no more fuel to keep even critical infrastructure functioning. This is the moment that separates theory from reality. For decades, analysts speculated about what would happen if Cuba lost its energy subsidies. They wrote reports, made projections, debated scenarios. Now the answer is in the streets of Havana, Santiago, Camagüey. And the answer is chaos. Hospitals enter catastrophe mode. Doctors have to choose which patients receive the last liters of diesel for generators. Choosing who lives and who dies not by medical criteria, but by energy availability. A 60-year-old woman dies during cardiac surgery when the generator fails. She could have been saved at any other moment in Cuban history. But not now. The food distribution system collapses completely. Without refrigeration, tons of meat rot within 48 hours. Without transportation, food remains stuck in warehouses while people go hungry just a few kilometers away. Official rationing loses any meaning. There is nothing to ration when there is no way to distribute. Violence escalates to levels unseen since the revolution. Crowds invade government warehouses searching for food. Clashes between civilians over drinking water result in serious injuries. The army is called in to control looting, but many soldiers simply abandon their posts. Why? Because their families are also without water, without food, without electricity. Institutional loyalty does not survive when your mother needs insulin that does not exist. And then the unthinkable happens. In the early hours of the 17th day, senior military officers meet in an emergency session. Details leak out slowly, but the essence is clear. There is a deep division over the path forward. Some argue for maintaining the regime at any cost. Others argue that without energy, there is no regime to defend. The fracture is not ideological, it is pragmatic. How do you govern a country that literally does not function? Meanwhile, international pressure reaches a critical point. Images of hospitals without power circulate globally. Videos of children drinking contaminated water go viral. Humanitarian NGOs call for urgent access. The UN convenes an emergency meeting of the Security Council. But the debate stalls in the same place as always. The United States insists that sanctions will only be lifted with regime change. Russia and China condemn the approach but offer no viable alternative. It is in this vacuum that the most controversial proposal emerges. A group of Latin American countries offers mediation. They propose an emergency agreement, immediate humanitarian aid in exchange for a Cuban commitment to internationally supervised elections within 90 days. It is not a negotiated transition. It is managed collapse. An attempt to avoid civil war while there is still time. The response from the Cuban government is silence. It does not formally reject it. It does not accept it. Just silence. Because internally, the power elite is fragmented. Each faction calculating its chances of political survival under different scenarios. Some see elections as a betrayal of decades of history. Others see them as the only way out before everything collapses violently. In the streets, people do not wait for distant political decisions. Communities organize their own survival systems based on available local resources. Community wells manually dug to extract water. Urban gardens planted in absolutely every available space in cities. Collective kitchens using gathered firewood because there is no functioning piped gas. It is a forced and involuntary regression to pre-industrial methods of social organization. Cuba in 2026 operating like a 19th century society, but with cell phones that cannot be charged. But there is something different in the air. For the first time in decades, conversations about an alternative future happen openly in squares and homes. Not whispered in fear. Not encoded in metaphors. Open and direct. Because when you have been in absolute darkness for 26 consecutive hours, the fear of talking about change loses importance compared to the visceral fear of continuing to live like this indefinitely. The question now is not whether there will be change. The question is what kind of change, and at what cost. As the world watches, Cuba stands at a historic crossroads. Every path forward is unknown. Every choice is risky. And the time to decide is running out as fast as the oil ran out. Day 20. Something has to give. And it does. Not through a bloody revolution or foreign invasion, but through something more complex and less cinematic: exhaustion. The regime realizes there is no way to govern a country without energy. The armed forces realize there is no way to repress a population when their own soldiers are hungry. The population realizes that protests without an energy solution only prolong suffering. The stalemate breaks when Brazil, Mexico, and Colombia present a final proposal. Immediate humanitarian aid including 200,000 barrels of oil as an emergency measure. Credit lines to rebuild energy infrastructure. In exchange, Cuba accepts an internationally supervised political transition process. It is not surrender. It is not anyone's victory. It is a collective recognition that the current model is unsustainable without an external patron willing to subsidize it indefinitely. The Cuban government accepts. Not out of ideological conviction, but out of a lack of viable alternatives. The first oil tankers arrive within 72 hours. Electricity gradually returns. First to hospitals and water systems. Then to residences under controlled rotation. The lights come back on in Havana, but everyone knows that something fundamental has changed forever. Because what happened in Cuba was not just an energy crisis. It was a real-time experiment in structural dependence. For decades, the country built its economy on a false premise: there will always be someone willing to pay the bill. The Soviet Union paid from 1960 to 1991. Venezuela took over from 2000 to 2026. But patrons are not eternal. And when they disappear, they take with them the illusion of sustainability. The lesson Cuba offers the world is not about socialism versus capitalism. It is about systemic vulnerability. Any nation that outsources its basic survival is building on sand. Ideology does not matter. Alliances do not matter. The moment you cannot feed your population or keep your lights on without continuous external support, you have lost real sovereignty. You retain symbols of independence while fundamentally depending on others to exist. And that dependence creates fragilities that go beyond the economy. Cuba developed world-class medicine, but did not produce enough energy for its hospitals. It trained brilliant engineers, but imported 73% of the electricity it consumed. It invested in universal education, but traded teachers for oil. Contradictions that only hold as long as external resources remain constant. The strategic mistake was believing that this flow would be permanent. When Chavez took power in Venezuela in 1999, it seemed logical to build an alliance based on exchanging services for energy. Venezuelan oil was abundant. Cuban demand was predictable. Both regimes shared an ideological vision. All the elements for a lasting partnership were present. Except one, a guarantee of continuity. Because regimes change. Geopolitical priorities change. Economic situations change. The only constant is change. And national strategies based on imagined constancy eventually collapse in catastrophic fashion. Other countries should pay attention. Many nations around the world operate under similar models of dependence. Energy dependence, food dependence, technological dependence, financial dependence. Each assumes its suppliers will remain reliable indefinitely. Each ignores the fundamental lesson Cuba learned the hardest way possible: dependence is fragility disguised as convenience. True sovereignty begins with a basic capacity for independent survival. This does not mean total autarky or economic isolation. It means ensuring that functions essential to national life can continue even if all external alliances disappear simultaneously. Sufficient energy. Basic food. Potable water. Critical medicines. Minimum industrial production capacity. Cuba in 2026 proved that without these foundations, everything else is built on a vacuum. The lights came back on in Havana. But they came back different. Every Cuban who spent 26 hours in absolute darkness now knows that electricity is not a guaranteed right. It is the result of strategic decisions made decades earlier. And bad decisions have consequences that manifest abruptly when circumstances change. If you made it this far, subscribe to the channel and leave your like. Comment which city or country you are watching from. Because stories like this are not just about Cuba. They are about the choices nations make and the prices populations pay when those choices prove unsustainable. The final question is not whether Cuba will survive. It will. The question is how many other nations will have to go through a similar collapse before learning the fundamental lesson: dependence is not a strategy. It is vulnerability waiting for the right moment to manifest.